Three times in 19 years, Israel has gone to war with her Arab neighbors. Each time, Israel has won. But none of its victories has been as stunning as the triumph that was sealed tonight when Syria, the last of the major Arab nations actually fighting the Israelis, agreed to a ceasefire. Earlier today, Egypt agreed, and yesterday, of course, Jordan said it would stop the fighting. The Syrian ceasefire, announced tonight by Radio Damascus, for all practical purposes ends the war, and it is safe to say that things will never again be the same in the Middle East.
In 1967, in a preemptive strike against Arab forces building up for an attack on the State of Israel, Israeli forces would triumphantly reaffirm their right of existence and keep the region in a tragic cycle of violence with no end in sight. The region once called the Levant, known as the Holy Land, has been the birthplace of the three largest monotheistic faiths. Today, the same land has been the epicenter of some of the most virulent geopolitical battles that have kept the region in perpetual turmoil. On May 14, 1948, when the British Mandate of Palestine was nearing its end, this coveted land would be recognized as an independent state by the United Nations passage of Resolution 181. The United Nations decision would cause an immediate reaction by the Arab League to rebuke the creation of this Jewish state. The Israelis, while outnumbered, would defeat the Arab forces in this first war for independence. This would not resolve the conflict. Over the next 10 years, several major alliances would be formed to undermine the possibility for coexistence between the Arabs and Israelis. The USSR saw Egypt as a way to gain an advantage over the West, using their relationship to cut off oil from America and threaten NATO in southern Europe. Consequently, America and its Western European allies would assist Israel. Tragic tension between Israel and the Arab League would culminate in May of 1967, when the Soviet Union would misinform Egypt that the Israelis were moving troops to the Syrian border. President Nasser of Egypt responded by sending his troops to the Sinai Peninsula. Border disputes would increase hostilities between the Arab states and Israel, and bloody threats poured out of the Arab radio stations onto the pages of Israeli newspapers.
That if Israel attacks, she will be completely destroyed. Yeah. And some Arab leaders actually say that their aim is the elimination of Israel without any qualification. Now, what does this mean?
If somebody attacks you, what would be your reaction? Somebody attacks us, we will react. React in war means destruction.
Only 22 years after the end of the Holocaust, it was not surprising that Arab propaganda hit home. Tensions would burn slowly as each party stood waiting for the next move. Israel's generals believed they could beat Egypt, a more sizable military machine. At this point, war was inevitable.
The Israeli Air Force won the decisive battle in the opening hours of the conflict Monday morning, catching the bulk of the Arab air power sitting on its airfields, and after that, Israel controlled the air over the combat zones, and the tremendous Arab superiority in men, in tanks and armaments was canceled out.
June 5, 1967, in an Israeli preemptive strike called Operation Focus, the Israeli Air Force would bomb and destroy over 400 Egyptian aircrafts. The IAF would also destroy planes from Syria and Jordan. Israeli pilots had won full control of the skies over the Middle East. In retaliation, Jordan and Syria would begin bombing Israeli towns on the border of the Golan Heights. Just before midday, fighting started in Jerusalem, the Holy City. The Jordanians opened fire, ignoring Israeli signals that Jordan would be spared if it stayed out of the war. By the end of this day, all of the world was focused on the Holy Land.
On Monday, the first day of the war, the Israelis took the Gaza Strip and started their push into the Sinai Desert. They also began an encircling movement around Old Jerusalem.
On June 6, the Israeli Air Force was weakened after leading full-fledged assaults for almost 24 hours. The Israeli ground troops began to push forward through the Gaza Strip. The Egyptians began retreating from bases in the area and destroying their own forts and equipment. This gave the Israelis the ability to capture Gaza, Ras al-Nakeb, and Jebel Libna. On the West Bank, the Syrians began bombing Israeli towns and fortifying their own border in Golan. Simultaneously, Israel was fighting Jordan along the West Bank. Israeli ground troops were strong and were able to take control of Ramallah, northeast Jerusalem, and Ammunition Hill. The Israeli pressure on the Eastern Front forced Jordanian militants to retreat from the area.
Tuesday, the Israeli army had carved out a large area of the Sinai and began to push the Jordanian army back at a rapid pace. The news tightened around Jerusalem.
On June 7th, the UN Security Council presented a ceasefire that was accepted by King Hussein of Jordan. Pressure was on Israel now to respond and accept the ceasefire. The third day of the war marked the first time in almost 20 years where Jews were allowed to visit the Holy City.
On Wednesday, the Israeli drive was almost complete in Jordan. The Sinai campaign brought the Israelis to the door of the Suez Canal at least one point, and Sharm el-Sheikh was captured, unblocking the Gulf of Aqaba. And tonight,
June 8th, Israel finished their assault to the West Bank by taking the city of Hebron, a famous holy site that Jews were banned from for years. White fabric hung throughout the city as the Arabs peacefully surrendered. The Syrians, however, continued firing on Israeli towns in Golan, and the Israeli Defense Force would destroy bridges along the Jordan River. Egypt, in acknowledgement of their defeat, accepted the terms of the ceasefire. Early in the morning on June 9th, IAF planes would surge into the Golan Heights, opening a new front in the war and attempting to put an end to the Syrian bombardment. The world watched in horror as tragic and frightening footage was broadcast on every news channel.
מבצע שהוטל עלינו לבצע זה פינוי התושבים. אתה לוקח את הערבי הזה והופך אותו לפליט.
Due to the unrelenting force of the IDF and the IAF, on June 10th of 1967, in only 6 days, Israeli forces triumphed over the Arab League.
But behind this victory was Israel's universal military training, tough-minded administration, competent commanders, and most of all, a dedicated people. The Arab nations were short in all these departments.
10 days after the war ended, the National Unity Government of Israel offered to give the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt and the Golan Heights back to Syria in exchange for peace agreements. The Arab League held a summit in Khartoum, Sudan, and passed the Khartoum Resolution. They were in no mood to go cap in hand to the country that humiliated them. By the end of the conference, the Arab League decided that there would be no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations with Israel. One important shift that resulted from the summit, however, was Egypt's, Jordan's, and Israel's immediate acceptance of the UN Security Resolution 242. Approved in November of 1967, it recognized the right of every state in the area to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. There was, however, no mention of Palestinians living in Israeli territory. Paradoxically, defeat in 1967 helped to start the Palestinian National Movement, which emerged out of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which, while led by Yasser Arafat, was only a puppet of Nasser. Once Arafat knew that the resolution failed to address the Palestinians as an independent nation, a new tragic era would begin. The Six-Day War's impact brought both a triumphant sense of national determination for the Israelis, but a tragic sense of betrayal by the Palestinians, who were undermined by their own Arab brothers. In Israel, international interest in the country grew exponentially, and the country's economy flourished. With new parts to Lebanon under Israel's control, Jews could once again visit sites they had been locked away from for the first time in decades. The Western Wall and Temple Mount would bring Jews from all around the world back to their Holy Land. For the Palestinians, corrupt leadership under the Arafat regime has divided loyalties between the government of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Living under Israeli control has only worked to create further resentment and hostilities that has flared up in tragic violence. Today, Israel maintains a complete air and sea blockade of Gaza and a partial blockade of goods and people through 2 land crossings. The Holy Land, with Jerusalem at its heart, is a place where the great tectonic plates of religion, culture, and nationalism come together. The fault lines that run between them are never quiet and always dangerous. Ignoring the legacy of 1967 is not an option.